Are you one of the millions of people who visits the Sydney Harbour Bridge each year? Perhaps you've seen it from the air as you fly into the city, orientating you as an unmistakable sign you're in Sydney. You've travelled across it by train, by car or on foot, and for a moment you look up and marvel at the crosswalk of steel above. It's no longer a bridge, but a work of art. Whether you're a tourist looking at the bridge from across the harbour at Bennelong Point, with another of the city's icons, the Opera House, behind you, or a regular commuter whose entry to the bridge is greeted with a beep, signalling you've paid the now invisible toll, the feeling that the bridge evokes is both ubiquitous and deeply personal. The bridge changed the civic and cultural life of Sydney forever. It established Sydney as a truly global city, with a landmark to compete with any of the modern world's great buildings and architectural structures.
Sydney Harbour Bridge, so long a dream, is today a bold and practical reality. A triumphant arch of steel, humanising our landscape in the ideals of all true Australians. A work of service, a thing of beauty, which asserts itself long after we are gone.
JJC Bradfield, Building the Bridge. The Sydney Harbour Bridge is an engineering icon, instantly recognisable around the world as synonymous with its city. But to build the bridge was an enormous undertaking. Politically, economically and physically, it would prove to be deadly. It was a public works accomplishment that made it a modern marvel of its time. The journey to build the bridge would take almost a century to complete and would stretch its city's resources almost to breaking point. In the end, it would unite Sydney as a global city, but at many points along the way, it was a dream that was almost never realised. In this 5-part series, you'll be taken back through history to retrace this journey of almost 100 years of tumult and triumph. You'll hear stories of the people who made the Sydney Harbour Bridge a reality, those it inspired and those it defeated, the lives it saved and those it took, the people it transported and those it moved on. This is episode 1, the story of how a bridge transformed a city into an international destination, and the long and sometimes treacherous road it took to get there. If you stand on the southern side of Sydney Harbour, you see the city stretching out before you in an almost seamless extension, the two sides of the city together as one. The narrow artery that joins these 2 points is constantly flowing, circulating life in, out and around. Standing there in the heart of the harbour, the bridge is giving the city life. The bridge is such an intrinsic part of the city, so synonymous with its namesake, that it's hard to imagine a time before it was there. Perhaps that's because even in the early days of the colony that would become the City of Sydney, there was pressure from the public on the government to build a permanent crossing, linking the north and south sides of the city across its great natural harbour. But another group of people were crossing the harbour long before white settlement.
Theirs was a canoe culture, and the waters of Port Jackson were their true highways. The English ships would change their lives forever.
Aboriginal Odysseys, 1790 to 1850. Murray Ngawi, State Library of New South Wales. The harbour peoples of the Eora Nation, in what is now known as the City of Sydney, lived with an abundance of fishing trading routes, which they travelled in carved wooden canoes, called Ngawi, which were up to 4 metres long and 1 metre wide, large enough for a fire to be kept burning in their centre. Men fished with spears, and women with hand lines and lures. Here, the British entered Port Jackson in a fleet of 11 tall-masted ships, bringing with them roughly 1,500 British citizens, half of them convicts, with marines, seamen, civil officers and free people, and a large store of supplies for the intended colony. It was here that Governor Arthur Phillip chose Sydney Cove in the harbour of Port Jackson as the site of the first British outpost and convict colony in Australia.
Having passed between the capes, which form its entrance, we found ourselves in a port superior in extent and excellency to all we had seen before, enjoying the luxuriant prospect of its shores covered with trees to the water's edge.
Wat Kan Tench, 1789. The natural grandeur of the harbour evoked rapturous visions in those who saw it for the first time. The natural philosopher Erasmus Darwin had arrived in Sydney Cove in 1789, 1 year into the life of the colony. On seeing the bay, he wrote a poem, Visit of Hope to Sydney Cove, which hinted uncannily at the city's future and the great bridge that would eventually join the land on either side of the body of water.
There shall broad streets their stately walls extend, the circus widen and the crescent bend. There, rayed from cities o'er the cultured land, shall bright canals and solid roads expand. There the proud arch, colossus-like, bestride.
When the British first arrived in 1788, almost 8,000 Indigenous people were living in the greater area of what had now been named Sydney by the British. But within just 2 years, only 1,000 would remain. Over the next 20 years, the white population would grow to 10,000 as the nascent city expanded, rapidly encroaching on and erasing the Eora nation in its wake. Still, many Indigenous people continued to travel through, trade, and live in the area that came to be known as Sydney. By the 1820s, Sydney's population had exploded, swelled by continual arrivals coming by sea. The original settlement on the south side of the harbour continued to expand into the growing Sydney Basin, and the settlement on the North Shore had taken root. At this time, before even the idea of the construction of a harbour bridge, the only way to cross the water was to go by boat, a sometimes treacherous undertaking, or to go the long way around, a journey that could take the better part of a day. This vexing transport issue provided a fertile opportunity for the more ambitious business people of the new city. Competition soon emerged in the increasingly crowded harbour. In 1813, an enterprising former convict, Billy Blue, on completing his sentence in Sydney, established the very first public ferry service, running a route from Blues Point, named for himself, to Dawes Point.
His passengers apparently generally did the rowing from Dawes Point to Blues Point, and they would pay him for the return journey. He always carried a sack on his shoulder and wheedled people for food, beer or clothing.
The companion guide to Sydney, Ruth Park. The success of this business venture would bring Blue great wealth, and he was given land on the North Shore by Governor Macquarie, who had dubbed Blue the Commodore, and who was one of the many city officials charmed by Blue's banter. In 1861, the Sydney Ferry Company was established and ran the first commercial ferry service between Circular Quay and Kirribilli. Sydney Ferries Limited also joined the growing water transit system and ran services between Neutral Bay and Mossman, and established a tradition of naming their vessels after prominent members of Indigenous communities: Bungaree, Bennelong and Barangaroo. The ferries moved everything, not just people, but vehicles and horsemen. As Ruth Park described in her book, The Companion Guide to Sydney,
Well, the ferries are very cosy, like domesticated elephants.
by 1890, more than 5 million passengers, 3.5 million vehicles, and almost 45,000 horsemen were crossing the harbour each year in an often chaotic and increasingly dangerous choreography of movement that kept the city turning. The Australian writer Christina Stead captured this scene in her novel, 7 Poor Men of Sydney.
The ferries flock into Circular Quay each morning at 8 and 9 o'clock. The people burst out of the turnstiles in streams, which go twisting uptown through the narrow streets. Some walk in the cool, and some choose the sun. The office boys in worn school jackets, the clerks in unpressed slop suits, the girls in light blouses and thin floating dresses are already sweating and flushing with the heat.
By the 1900s, Sydney had become the busiest port city in Australia. At peak hour, up to 75 ferries would be docked at any one time, bobbing in the water, taking 13 million passengers a year back and forth across the harbour. Services now ran to Balmain along the Parramatta River and to the eastern suburbs. The number of passengers had jumped to 27 million a year by 1927, and overcrowding made these journeys increasingly dangerous, and for some commuters would even prove deadly.
The thing was, with all these ferries up until wartime, the men would all stand on the sides, they'd stand up on the railing. The ferry would have a terrific list as it got into the wharf, wonder if they didn't go over. It was amazing to watch them. And the men would all jump off and run for the trams to get a seat. There were the poor girls and all men when they wanted to come and get on the trams. They were basically lucky if they got a seat.
Lydia Bubbles Rowe. But the idea of a bridge big enough to cross the harbour seemed fanciful to most people of Sydney, an undertaking beyond the resources of the fledgling city. And the ferry operators, each running a very healthy business, were vocally opposed to the idea of such a bridge that might lure away their loyal customers. To them too, it seemed impossible and undesirable. Yet, as the city grew, bridges of more modest length were built to ease the burden on the ferry crowds, and to get from one side of the harbour to the other was known as the Journey of the Five Bridges, crossing at Piermont, Glebe Island, Iron Cove, Gladesville and Fig Tree. This was hardly an efficient way to cross the ever-growing city. So, in the minds of some of the most ambitious town planners and engineers in the new metropolis, there were plans growing for a centrepiece of engineering that would meet the needs, and more so the ambitions, of the new city of Sydney. It would take over 100 years, 4 government bridge plan competitions, over 70 designs, and many more dreamers for those ambitions to be realised.
Now, who will stand at my right hand and build the bridge with me?
Henry Parkes, 1888. Travelling across Sydney Harbour by ferry is an experience to behold. The city's iconic views surround you, and the shelter of the harbour makes the ride smooth enough to move even the most jaded Sydney commuter, turning them for a moment into a tourist at home, if only for as long as the journey lasts. The vessels that crisscross the harbour today are a far cry from those first public ferries that struggled to serve the city's growing population, and where passengers sometimes paid with their lives. Back then, a better solution for moving people across the city was desperately needed. But even though the ambition for a harbour bridge was evident for years, it would take a plague, 4 public design competitions, and a determined futurist for it to become a reality. We examined the drive to develop a crossing over the harbour from the south to the north, what form it would take, who would fund it, and how to unite a divided city. There had first been designs put forward for a permanent bridge crossing Sydney Harbour as far back as 1840. That early proposal was for a floating structure, 45 feet wide, anchored by fixed channels, and to be propelled by steam, supposedly at incredible speed, to move people and vehicles across the water. The first public design competition was held in 1900, but as the city grew and political tides changed rapidly, none of these would come to fruition. In 1815, the government architect and former convict Francis Greenway had written a letter to the Australian newspaper, arguing that such a bridge would
give an idea of strength and magnificence that would reflect credit and glory on the colony and the mother country.
Greenway's plan had been to build a fort on Observatory Hill, with a supplementary fort on Dawes Point. He would then construct a bridge to the northern shore of the harbour. There were other proposals for floating bridges, a pontoon bridge, swing bridges, high-level bridges, 7-span bridges, tunnels and subaqueous tube tunnels. It was even suggested at one time that the harbour itself could be filled in. In 1880, the then Premier of New South Wales, Henry Parkes, had petitioned for a harbour bridge to be built in time to commemorate the first centenary of the colony, an anniversary which ultimately came and went, with no such monument rising to meet the deadline. A commentator at the time noted,
"Someone must have been standing on Parkes's right hand
to prevent this from happening. And in 1890, a Royal Commission of Inquiry was called into the possible connection between the city and the North Shore. There were other pressing needs that supported the case for a harbour bridge. The catalyst for action would not come from one person, but from hundreds. In the rapidly growing city, houses were crowded, streets congested, and waterways bursting with people. Town planning had failed to keep up with the demands of the expansion, and with poor sewerage and overcrowding, conditions were ripe for disease. On the 19th of January 1900, the first plague epidemic broke out in Sydney. In 7 months, over 300 people were infected, and of those, 103 would die. With over 5 million passengers, nearly 4 million vehicles and almost 44,000 horsemen being moved each year by ferry, and with the breakout of the bubonic plague in the early 1900s, it became clear that the rambling city of Sydney had grown like an untamed weed and was on the brink of being beyond control. To bring order to this chaos, the city would need to start over. The entire remodelling of Sydney would offer an opportunity for the long-awaited bridge to rise. Parts of North Sydney and Millers Point were demolished to remove the shanties and shacks that dotted the point. In their place came plans for an underground railway system and the bridge that would finally join the two sides of the city. The daunting amount of work to be done would make this the largest public works project ever attempted in New South Wales. Between 1900 and 1924, the government ran 4 separate bridge design competitions. By 1924, over 20 designs had been submitted from national and international engineering companies and were then exhibited at the Queen Victoria Markets on the modern site of the Queen Victoria Building in the city's central business district. But none of these hopefuls would succeed in meeting the rigorous demands of Sydney's citizens or its city planners. The two strongest contenders to finally emerge were Norman Self and John Job Crew Bradfield, who each had different and ambitious visions for the harbour. Self, an engineer, naval architect, inventor, urban visionary and advocate of technical education, had arrived with his family in Sydney in 1855. His planning dreams for Sydney were grand, and he'd even conceived of a harbour crossing decades before the harbour bridge we know today was built. But for all of his innovative ideas, Self was not hugely successful as a town planner in his lifetime, though many of his progressive visions were later realised. His 1901 design for a harbour bridge from Dawes Point to McMahon's Point was accepted by the New South Wales government, but it too was never built, falling prey to the city's political tides. Self then won a second competition outright in 1903. He saw a steel cantilever bridge stretching from Dawes Point to McMahon's Point. The selection board was unanimous in its praise.
The structural lines are correct and in true proportion, and the outline is graceful.
Still, Self would not win. His vision would again be lost to the vagaries of the economics of the city and a change of government in 1904. In the end, Self would never even be given the £1,100 prize he was entitled to, nor was he paid for his subsequent work on the plans, which he estimated to be worth more than £20,000. In his book, published in 1908, Self wrote that the competition
has spelt ruin rather than reward to the successful competitor and cast a dark shadow upon the fair name of New South Wales.
The man who would become synonymous with the bridge was instead John Job Crewe Bradfield, a civil engineer with a brilliant academic mind. Bradfield was a paradox, a bold visionary planner, but as an engineer, he displayed caution. He planned on a vast scale, and though his visions were futuristic, they had a distinct old-fashioned look to them. In 1912, at the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Public Works, he submitted a design for a cantilever bridge stretching from Dawes Point to Milson's Point, which was given the government's approval. But before any kind of construction could begin, the country would be drawn into the First World War, where almost 1 million Australians would serve, over 27,000 lose their lives, and over 30,000 would be taken as prisoners of war. In the years of global tumult that followed the end of the war, Bradfield travelled the world researching bridge designs. He would come upon an arch bridge that was suitable for the enormous span of Sydney Harbour, and cheaper by at least £400,000 than a cantilever bridge. It was Hell's Gate Bridge in New York City, a steel-through, single-arch bridge crossing the East River between Astoria, Queens, and the island of Manhattan. Among the many people who worked with Bradfield, the least known is Kathleen Butler, whose official title was secretary, but she was also known as the Bridge Girl. Kathleen Butler was Bradfield's eyes and ears. Mr. Peach was a public works engineer on the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
He was overseas with a group of engineers from his staff to examine possible tenderers for the construction of the Harbour Bridge, and Miss Butler was still back in Dr. Bradfield's office. She became aware, now that's a good way of putting it, she became aware that the idea of recalling Dr. Bradfield and his staff and putting a stop to any further work on the development of the bridge itself. She fortunately knew exactly where Dr. Bradfield was at that time, so completely of her own volition, she sent Dr. Bradfield a cable and suggested he should be somewhere else at that particular time, and never caught up with him.
Returning to Sydney, and with much finagling, Bradfield had managed to convince the city's politicians that it would be possible to build a similar single-arch bridge across Sydney Harbour that would not block its shipping lanes, a major sticking point for the city's planners. Yet, the wheels of Sydney's bureaucracy still turned painfully slowly. Back in 1916, the Honourable John Daniel Fitzgerald, a housing reformer and town planner, had introduced the ill-fated Sydney Harbour Bridge Bill to the Legislative Council and had said of the political football,
This bridge has been the sport of politicians for the whole of that period. It will open up those splendid areas of undulating land which are so admirably suited for the purposes of the building of homes of citizens, the housing of the happy and healthy people on that side of the harbour.
And so it would, if only the political will could be summoned for the vexed project to actually begin. Finally, in 1924, the Harbour Bridge Act was carried, and that same year, Bradfield recommended that the government should accept the tender of Dorman, Long & Co. of Middlesbrough, England. They had built a very similar-looking bridge to Hell's Gate, crossing the river between Newcastle upon Tyne and Gateshead in northern England.
The tender recommended for the two-hinged arch bridge with granite masonry facing is my design as sanctioned by Parliament and as submitted for tenders. Due to our gallant soldiers, Australia has recently been acclaimed a nation. In the upbuilding of any nation, the land slowly moulds the people. The people, with patient toil, alter the face of the landscape. They humanize the landscape after their own image.
Dorman Long & Co. would come to win out of more than 20 competing designs. And decades after the initial desire for a bridge to cross Sydney Harbour had first been given voice, the path was set for the most ambitious construction project that Australia had ever seen. Bradfield announced his vision in a speech in 1921.
This is the engineer. He sees, expresses passing in the air like toys adrift upon the breeze, and the common carts and wagons where the common seabirds soar and wheel. Linking the hills on either side, it dwarfs the city, ships and tide, a giant skiff with paint and pride, a dream translated into steel.
And so the visions of countless planners, designers, dreamers and engineers would shortly come to be realised. But it would be a task as colossal as the structure itself. The bridge would take 8 years, 1,400 labourers, 6 million hand-driven rivets, and the lives of over 16 workers. To build the Sydney Harbour Bridge would be a human undertaking as colossal as the structure itself. It would take 8 years, 1,400 labourers, and as many as 6 million hand-driven rivets. The rivets would connect roughly 52,800 tonnes of steel beams, covered in 272,000 litres of paint, at the cost of just over £6.25 million, taken out in loans that would take 55 years to pay off through taxes and tolls. In 2018 values, the total cost of the bridge was over 500 million Australian dollars. Once completed, it would stand as the largest single-arch bridge in the world. Even the grandest plans must start small. And on the afternoon of the 28th of July 1923, at 3 in the afternoon, the Honourable Richard Thomas Ball sank a shovel into the dirt outside the North Sydney railway station to turn the sod and mark the beginning of construction on the North Shore side of the harbour. The Mayor of North Sydney, G.T. Clark, was met with loud cheers as he said,
"I have the honour of presiding at this celebration, a prelude to one of the greatest events about to take place in modern history, the construction of the Sydney Harbour Bridge."
Bradfield's initial plans for the Sydney Harbour Bridge were only one part of his unified vision for the city, to completely modernise its transport system through an electrified suburban railway that would span above and below ground to service the now sprawling city of more than 1 million residents.
Engineering encompasses the utility of material things with the beauty of spiritual things.
Bradfield had said in 1924. He had lobbied hard for the winning design of the eventual bridge we know today as a global icon in Sydney. A single arch bridge of such huge proportions, its span would come to just over 1 kilometre in length, was going to be much more difficult to build than any other competing design. But Bradfield was sure that the solid rock of the harbour's foreshores could more than withstand the weight of the giant structure.
Future generations will judge our generation by our works. For that reason, and from consideration from the past, I have recommended granite, strong, imperishable, a natural product, for the facing of the piers.
Dorman Long & Co.'s successful tender had specified that all the materials and, most importantly, labour for the project would be sourced locally. The granite for the decorative pylons would come from Moruya, the sand from the Nepean River, the cement from Kandos. Ultimately, the majority of the steel would come imported from England, with just 20% locally fabricated at steelworks in Newcastle. Still, the bridge would quickly rise to be a potent symbol of hope during the crushing years of the Depression, bringing new jobs to many hundreds of people and establishing Sydney as a city with ambitions to take on the world. It's often said that success has many parents, and the Sydney Harbour Bridge was no exception. A bitter rivalry broke out between Bradfield and Ralph Freeman, a consulting engineer with Dorman Long & Co., who also claimed credit for the design and who had been responsible for final plans under the contract with the government. In 1929, Freeman said in the Sydney Morning Herald that Bradfield
did not inspire a single feature of the design.
And that Bradfield had contributed
No more a design of a bridge than a photograph of a liner was the design of a ship.
Despite this animosity, historians now say this was more an argument about the meaning of the word design, and that the final bridge was based on Bradfield's initial plans and executed by Freeman in the final construction. Watching the construction of the bridge became a hugely popular pastime for Sydneysiders throughout its near decade of construction. As the structure took its shape, hundreds of people gathered daily to bear witness to the Herculean task being undertaken before their eyes. The concrete pylons rose first, on either side of the harbour, each fronted with granite quarried from Moruya, more than 300 kilometres away to the south of Sydney. Reg Saunders worked as an apprentice stonemason at the Moruya quarry. He was only 19 years old when he began his apprenticeship. Born in 1909, Reg was raised in Moruya and was encouraged to take the apprenticeship on the advice of his father.
You would get a go on and you'd get more confident, and the more confident you became, the harder you would hit, until a critical moment would crop up when instead of hitting the head of the punch, you would miss and hit your hand. You would knock a piece of skin off your hand as big as a shilling piece, and the blood would flow. The initiation period would go on for, say, 3 months.
Beginning in 1928, the construction of the coat hanger steel arch itself began, which would come to weigh 39,000 tonnes. It would take 2 years for the arches to touch in the middle. An architectural feat which had been fraught with anxiety for the engineers. If their planning and building had been successful or not would only be known once the meeting of the arch was attempted. This moment of triumph was realised when the arch seamlessly met in the middle on the 19th of August 1930. The top and bottom chords were riveted together. The arch now supported itself, and the giant cables could be removed. The historic moment was marked with the raising of the British and Australian flags on either side of the bridge. Robert Emerson Curtis wrote of the heady excitement of the scenes in his book, Building the Bridge.
A year ago, the long grey shops at Milson's Point resounded with life. The air was filled with the thunder of metal, the ringing voice of the giant steel cutter, the ribald stuttering of electric riveters, the wanging of hammers and the shouts of men.
The bridge was never simply an arch across the water. For the bridge to function, far-reaching construction was needed that would reshape North Sydney. The ferry arcade at Milson's Point, where thousands of commuters had converged, was demolished. The ferries shifted, tram lines were rerouted, and a new highway linking the bridge to Lane Cove would pass through the heart of Milson's Point. people discovered with maps marked in pink that their home, their business, whole neighbourhoods would be demolished. In Lavender Bay, Reverend Cash, rector of Christ Church, documented the upheaval in some 3,000 photographs and wrote of the removal of the families in his book, Parables of the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
No part of New South Wales has undergone such radical change within the last 60 years as Lavender Bay and Milson's Point. Within the compass of the foreshores of Dawes Point and Milson's Point, we are witnessing day by day scenes of wondrous change.
Whole streets of the North Shore and the rocks that were in the path of the bridge were demolished. 500 homes were destroyed and 400 families displaced, with no compensation. Only landowners were deemed worthy of monetary benefits. Leaseholders and casual renters were left to fend for themselves. Such was the cost of progress in the city for those with the least power.
I do beg of you to allow me to hold on as long as possible. I should be left not only without a home, but without the means of living. Then crippled with rheumatism, I've been unable to go out and look for another house. But my next door neighbour, well, she's been out and about nearly every day, and she's been unable to hear of any place. And if she's much younger, more capable, and she couldn't meet with any success, there'd be no chance for me.
The news of impending homelessness was unceremoniously delivered to bewildered residents and shop owners in letters from the ministry.
Sir, I hereby, as agent for the Minister of Public Works, your landlord, and on his behalf, give you notice to quit and deliver up possession of house and premises.
Though its construction brought displacement and hardship to no small number of residents of Sydney, the building of the bridge would also bring major relief to others in the city in the devastation of the Depression years. Nationwide in 1932, unemployment hit an all-time high of 30%, but in Sydney, with the bridge, that would fall to just 10%. For its massive injection into the economy, the bridge became known as the Iron Lung. Its construction brought employment to a constant workforce of 1,400 men on site and many hundreds more in the steel, cement, sand and stone trades supplying its raw materials.
Sydney was ringed by soup kitchens. Every night, thousands slept in the parks, on railway stations and in odd shelters. Sydney became a city of beggars. Many had held good jobs in the past, but their spirit had been broken.
The government favoured giving this work to war veterans and union members and men with families. Working week hours on the bridge were cut from 44 to 33 hours, so more people could have jobs overall. They came from diverse backgrounds, reflecting the demographic makeup of the city. English engineers, Scottish and Italian stonemasons, American, British and European riggers, and Irish and English boilermakers and machinists. Gainful employment on the bridge, however, could come at a great cost for some labourers. The work was physically gruelling and incredibly dangerous, and so accidents were unavoidable. All told, 16 men were killed in accidents on the bridge and in its attendant work sites. It was a matter of course that these men would have to do things as dangerous as catching red-hot, newly forged rivets in buckets of water, which they held aloft while roped to the section of the bridge they were working on.
Ready!
They would catch these molten hot bolts of metal in the buckets, then hammer them into the beams they were standing on, hundreds of feet up in the air, and hope they weren't either hit by the scalding hot bolt or that they missed catching it, only for it to fall, perhaps fatally, on someone else working below. Vera Holliday worked in the Sydney Harbour Bridge Dawes Point office of Dorman Long as a comptometer operator. she vividly recalls the rivet boys.
The poor little rivet boys that used to catch the rivets. Of course, they were very, very clever at catching rivets in tin cans, and they had to be very accurate. But of course, the unexpected sometimes happened, and a chip would come off, and though their trousers would be well tucked into their boots, so every now and again one would go inside their boots, and believe me, that can of water that was ready, waiting for them to jump into, was always very welcome to them.
Many of the fatalities on the bridge were the result of monstrous injuries, such as those recalled by bridge worker Bob Colfax.
I can remember a native of Maria called Harry Waters, and he was a crane chaser, and he was sitting on the carriage and this huge counterweight was swinging around and it practically severed his leg. He was taken to the hospital, but he only survived for 2 or 3 days. And the other fatality was a quarryman called Percy Poole, also a local man from Maria.
Jack McRae was a concrete packer. He recalls the death of Tom McKeon.
The first accident that I can remember was in 1927 or 28. A chap by the name of Tom McKeon was killed on the Dawes Point side between the pylon and the next pier. Unfortunately, he was on a scaffold, and the chain operating this block became entangled in his leg, and the scaffolding capsized and Tom was falling to the ground. I went out to his funeral with a lot more that day.
Once the arch had been completed, the rest of the bridge was built with speed. By June of 1931, the deck running its length was in place and topped with asphalt. Rails were laid for trams and trains. In January 1932, the final piece of granite was laid on the northwest pylon. Then, in February of that year, the first true tests of the bridge were made, when it was load tested by 96 steam locomotives laid end to end. More than able to withstand these stress tests, the Sydney Harbour Bridge was declared safe for traffic, and it was announced soon after that it was now ready to welcome the sea of humanity that would cross its span every day for the rest of its life. On the 19th of March in 1932, after decades of acrimony, infighting, upheaval, and finally the incredible work of construction, the Sydney Harbour Bridge would be officially open to the public. But the controversy surrounding it did not end there. The opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge began and ended with fireworks, though one particular unexpectedly explosive display was not planned.
The arch that cut the skies. It happened this way. I had just come down after long years to look at Sydney town, and struth was I knocked endways. Fair surprise. I never dreamed. That arch that cut the skies. The bridge.
C.J. Dennis, I dips me lid to the Sydney Harbour Bridge, 1932. The arch on the Sydney Harbour Bridge was first joined on August 19th in 1930. It would take another 2 years for the decking and roadway to be put in place. Sydney-siders could not quite imagine how people, horses and vehicles would cross over the top of the mammoth new structure, as Sydney resident Anne Eggins recalled in 2017.
My father, who worked in his butcher's shop in Neutral Bay, told me that many people were sarcastic about the bridge because they thought the cars had to go up and over the arch. There were not many cars on the North Shore at that time, and none of them could have made the climb over the arch. They changed their tune when the bridge opened.
In order to prepare the city for the suitably momentous opening day, the Sydney Harbour Bridge Celebrations Committee formed in 1931. It launched a public appeal in October that year to raise £10,000 for the parade floats and attendant pomp and ceremony. The committee organised sporting competitions, art exhibitions, concerts, tours, balls, surf carnivals, a sailing regatta, a race meeting and a celebratory cricket match to mark the opening of the bridge on the 19th of March in 1932. The city spared no expense in its celebrations. a huge garden party for 2,500 guests was thrown at Government House, and the Lord Mayor and Lady Mayoress of the city held the lavish Sydney Harbour Bridge Ball at Sydney Town Hall. The Daily Telegraph reported,
Postponed for over a week, owing to threatening weather, the Government House garden party to commemorate the opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge was held yesterday in perfect autumn weather. The grounds of Government House looked their loveliest, lawns and flowers making a perfect picture. Picture hats far outnumbered the tiny autumn models, and almost every second frock followed the traditional garden party style, either in lace, georgette or chiffon. 3,000 received invitations. The guests drifted onto the lawns to await the arrival of the vice-regal party. After the national anthem, the Governor and Lady Game mingled with the crowds, receiving and greeting old friends.
An essay competition for school children was held on the topic of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, a landmark in Australian progress, with one aspiring young architecture critic awarded a prize for her entry. 10-year-old Mavis Combo of Cabbage Tree Island Aboriginal School on the Richmond River wrote approvingly of the finished bridge.
Travelling through tunnels and subways is certainly not as healthy as in the open fresh air. And Dr. Bradfield was quite right in opposing all underground schemes.
More congratulations for the bridge flowed from other school children across the state. A goodwill scroll of messages began its journey in the town of Tottenham, west of Melbourne, and from there travelled by foot, car, bicycle and horse, collecting the well wishes of hundreds of students from 72 schools. Finally, the captains of both Fort Street Boys and Girls High Schools, Reginald Sharp and Beryl Lamble, ran the scroll's last leg of its long journey, proudly delivering it to Premier Lang and Governor Game in the Department of Education at 4 p.m. on March 17th in 1932. In that year, on March 16th, over 10,000 school children excitedly crossed the bridge by foot on Children's Day, as Owen Hardy recalled of being 10 years old at the time.
It was a very wet, windy day. We walked across to Milton's Point, turned around there and came back over the bridge again. We had very strict instructions. We weren't to march in time. Some bridges have been known to fail during the war years in soldiers marching across bridges because they're all in step and marching at time. The beat destructed the bridges.
Attending the opening of the bridge was an occasion that warranted travelling great distances, and by any means. The Bulletin reported of one such journey.
A little lad on a plump little pony, Leonard Gwyther, who rode all the way from Gippsland to be here with us on this great occasion.
A 9-year-old boy, Lenny Gwyther, had saddled his horse Ginger Mick in February 1932 and ridden alone from rural Victoria to Sydney, a journey of almost 1,000 kilometres over 4 months. As a reward for his bravery, Lenny became a local hero and was invited to the official opening of the bridge, where he proudly rode Ginger Mick across its span. The then Labor Premier of New South Wales, Jack Lang, was not someone who was a fan of excess and ceremony, and when opening day finally came, VIPs found themselves crammed onto a small stage, with few having access to microphones, including the Prime Minister, Joseph Lyons. A determined Lang clashed with a contingent of people still loyal to the British monarchy, who demanded King George VI or the Governor-General open the bridge. The discord between the Premier's supporters and the Conservatives had come to a head during preparations for the opening. Increased security followed threats which had been made about disrupting the event, and there were suspicions and tip-offs about schemes brewing to cause a scene. As Ruth Park wrote in the Companion Guide to Sydney of the gathering for the ceremony, indeed a very great disruption was afoot.
It was these shabby people, haggard with hardship and hopelessness, who stood in their thousands on an autumn day to see the bridge open. They were surprised and amused to see a joker in the pack, an oddball named De Groot, whip in and cut the ribbon before the Premier could wave his scissors.
Francis de Groot was a member of the New Guard, the paramilitary right wing of the Conservative Party, loyal to the monarchy, many of whom had taken exception to the fact that no member of the royal family had been invited to officially open the bridge. Vera Holliday recalled the scene of de Groot crashing the ceremony.
When the bridge was opened, I was on top of the bridge, of course, opposite the official stand, and at one stage I saw a horseman approaching, hadn't seen him before, and he gave a magnificent salute to the official stand, and something made me watch him pass the stand and approach the ribbon. And then suddenly up went his sword and the ribbon was cut and down came Mr. de Groot.
De Groot was a Dublin-born antique dealer and retired cavalry officer, and had managed to make his way on horseback to the front of the assembled parties. And when he sliced the ribbon with his sword, he declared the bridge open in the name of
the decent and respectable people of New South Wales.
Scrambling, the official party did their best to retie the ribbon and carried on as if nothing had happened, while de Groot was dragged away by police. De Groot was fined for the cost of the ribbon and convicted of offensive behaviour, though he would eventually be paid out of court for a tidy sum for wrongful arrest. He also received many letters of support and admiration, and gifts from his growing number of fans, including a rose gold cigarette lighter engraved with
"He is not insane,"
of which he was initially accused in the wake of what came to be known as the incident. Unperturbed, and once the furor had died down over de Groot's crashing of the ceremony and self-appointed ribbon cutting, Premier Lang told the crowd,
"The achievement of this bridge is symbolic of the things Australians strive for but have not yet attained. The bridge itself unites people who have similar aims and ideals but are divided by geographic boundaries."
Lang, known as the Big Fella, had managed to ensure the successful completion of the bridge. He was a formidable man in his politics and in his physical presence, standing at almost 2 metres tall. And though he would preside over the opening of the bridge, later that year the Governor of New South Wales, Philip Game, would dismiss the Lang government over a dispute about the federal spending of the money of New South Wales. But on that day, in 1932, Premier Lang cut the retied ribbon and, marked by a 21-gun salute, declared the Sydney Harbour Bridge officially open. Lang and the official party then walked to the northern end of the bridge and were met by mayors from across the northern suburbs. Alderman Hubert Leslie Primrose, the mayor of North Sydney, cut the second ribbon, and celebrations began. Fastidious as ever, JJC Bradfield had arrived early that morning, well before the celebrations were due to begin, to make sure that everything was in order to his exacting standards for the bridge he had worked for so long to make a reality. Later in the day, he said of the building of the bridge,
"In tendering my thanks, I do not forget the workmen who so splendidly responded to the trusts we placed in them. Throughout, they worked magnificently and built the bridge a credit to industrial Australia."
This set off a long day of speeches, each acknowledging the extraordinary coordination of hundreds and thousands of people in realising the civic marvel of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, an undertaking so daunting that it had seemed, at many moments in its contentious history, that it might never have come to exist. But as they stood on the proof of the collective will of the City of Sydney, Governor Game read a message from King George VI to the crowd, which some said numbered as many as 1 million people.
"A magnificent triumph of engineering skill. May it be a means of increasing the prosperity of the people of Sydney and Australia."
People had come from all over Sydney and much further afield, across the country and from New Zealand, all to witness the opening of the bridge. The ceremony was broadcast nationwide to the UK and the United States.
Words are futile things to describe the might and majesty of this wonderful structure. Even pictures can hardly do it justice, because no lens is wide enough to capture in one great sweep its power, full grace and perfect symmetry. A ferry from the bridge, 170 feet above, looks almost like a toy, and even a deep-sea ship is dwarfed as she swings beneath the mighty structure. That is the picture of massive strength and transcending grace that meets the eye as you reach the pylon, and no other angle conveys so utterly the superlative beauty of this wonder of creation of man's brains and hands. All honor to those who built it, from the designer to the lowliest workman.
Below, in the shadow of the bridge, on the water, a flotilla of ships and vessels had gathered to get as close to the celebrations as possible. Celebrations which, in typical Sydney fashion, would last the whole week, with parade floats and parties crossing the city. At 7:50 p.m. on opening night, another proud Sydney tradition was born, when the first fireworks were let off from the bridge and into the sky, their bright tendril reflected in the shiny black of the nighttime harbour, as the crowd was awed by a sight like nothing they had ever seen.
Today, after 7 thrilling years, the bridge stands with its head in the sun, its feet on either shore, waiting the turning wheels of traffic.
Robert Emerson Curtis, building the bridge. After midnight, in the very early morning of March 20th, the first cars were allowed across the bridge, and Bradfield and his family were among the first to cross. The spectacle of the completion and opening of Sydney Harbour Bridge would continue to inspire joy and pride from the city long after the celebrations had ended, and began a tradition for how the bridge would be seen and used by the city from there on out. The legacy of that day was both immediate and long-lasting, said to be the inspiration for babies born in 1932 named Bridget, Archie, Sydney and Archibald. The opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge was a watershed moment for the city. Sydney was now an indisputably international city, ready to take its place on the world stage. The ease with which the harbour could now be crossed made the bridge's presence instantly felt across the city. The North Shore population exploded, and the ferry businesses, which had once done such a roaring trade, fell into immediate decline. The bridge soon became host to all manner of stunts and tourist attractions. The southeast pylon opened as an extremely popular lookout, commanding uninterrupted views of the city and beyond to the horizon, which awed Sydneysiders who had never been able to see it before. In 1942, the pylons were closed to the public when they were commandeered by the National Army in the Second World War, and were turned into machine gun turrets positioned to protect the harbour. In later decades, the Rockside pylon was home to an elegant tea room where chicken and ham cutlets were 5 shillings and a banana split was 2 and 6pence. In the 1960s, 2 white cats, twins, took up residence in the pylon and became their own tourist attraction when curious cat lovers would visit the siblings to feed and pat them. The 2 cats lived their entire lives in the pylon, slinking between the legs of people who had come to view the harbour through the telescopes mounted at the lookout. Between the 1940s and 70s, the Pylon Museum's guidebook offered a window into the impressions of visitors from around the country.
Height of happiness.
Wonderful.
Splendid. Melbourne is still tops. Still think the Yarra is better.
Can't beat Adelaide.
Too many steps. Need a drink. Fine view. Those stairs. Too dark. Can't see a thing.
I'll open your eyes, you mug.
Once the bridge was open to the public, the question of how to pay for its significant building and maintenance costs loomed. The first tolls were charged for travel in both directions, an announcement the Lang government had kept from the public until just 3 days before the opening, hoping that any major displeasure at the news would be lost amid the heady celebrations. Toll collectors stood out in the open road to collect fares in the years before booths were built to shield them from the traffic. Cars were charged a sixpence, around $2 in today's money, with threepence for each adult passenger and a penny for each child. A motorcyclist paid sixpence, a horse and rider threepence, while cyclists and pedestrians were able to cross free of charge. Getting your family over the bridge was even in those times an expensive undertaking, which inspired some clever workarounds from enterprising citizens like Brian Pearson, a bridge engineer who devised this savings method in the late 1940s.
Well, my earliest memory is crossing the bridge, not frequently but periodically, in my uncle's motor car with my younger sister and brother and mother. A blanket was in the back seat of the car so that the 3 kiddies could get under it, and as a consequence the head count for travelling across the bridge was quite low. It was quite hilarious for us to be pushed under the blanket on each trip.
But not all travellers on foot were exempted from tolls. In 1932, 6 elephants from the Worth's Circus Company were charged tuppence each by the toll collectors. By the 1980s, the tens of millions of vehicles which had by then crossed the bridge had recouped its original cost of $500 million in tolls. This did not, however, mean the end of paying to cross the bridge. Instead, tolls were increased by the state government to pay for the Sydney Harbour Tunnel, as well as for the ongoing costs of maintaining the bridge. Engineers, ironworkers, boilermakers, fitters, plasterers, electricians, carpenters, riggers, painters and plumbers all labour for 200,000 work hours a year to keep the bridge humming at the cost of $20 million annually. The Sydney Harbour Bridge was built with the intention to keep it in sound working order for 1,000 years. And much of that responsibility is in keeping it free of rust from the salt air of the harbour. The arch rises and falls by as much as 18 centimetres as the heat stress of Sydney's summers cause the steel beams to expand and contract. Every 5 years, the exposed parts of the bridge are repainted, a task requiring 30,000 litres of its trademark steel grey paint.
There were tiny flags on top, and the silhouetted ant forms of people arduously climbing the steep bow. It looked stabbed against the sky, as if nothing could remove it. It looked indelible. A coat hanger, guidebook said, but it was so much grander than this implied. The coherence of it, the embrace, the span of frozen hard labour, those bold pylons at the ends, the multi-millions of hidden rivets.
Gail Jones, 5 Bells. The bridge has always attracted thrill seekers who were determined to climb it, some illegally. In 1973, French high-wire walker Philippe Petit crossed on a wire suspended hundreds of feet up in the air between the 2 southern pylons. For the last 20 years, the slightly less adventurous among us have been able to take the guided Harbour Bridge climb over the arches, where the summit has inspired more than a few marriage proposals, one of which was ultimately refused, resulting in a quiet and awkward walk back down. Over its 86 years of life, the bridge has been a site of protest, civil action and celebration in Sydney. Its first closure was in 1946, when 20,000 people marched to celebrate Victory Day at the end of the Second World War. A sea of people walked across the bridge to mark its 50th, 60th and 75th anniversaries. And in May of 2000, a record-breaking 250,000 Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, marched across the bridge in the historic Walk for Reconciliation. When a skywriter wrote the word sorry in the clear blue winter sky above the harbour to acknowledge the dispossession of Australia's First Nations peoples, a dispossession which had begun with the arrival of the First Fleet in the very same place, the massive crowd roared. Internationally recognised as a symbol of progress and a vision of a bright future, the bridge remains one of Australia's most identifiable symbols. Sydney is among the first places on Earth to ring in the new year, and staking out a prime viewing spot to celebrate and ensure the best view of the New Year's Eve fireworks display on the harbour has become a hard-fought Sydney tradition. At 9 p.m. and midnight, the two spectacular pyrotechnics shows are months in the planning. The countdown to midnight show is over in only 12 minutes at the cost of $7 million, when more than 8 tons of rockets explode into the sky over the harbour, often cascading down from the bridge in a raucous celebration of life that has come to symbolise the heart and libidinous soul of Sydney.
Sydney Harbour Bridge carries more than cars and pedestrians. It carries expensive advertising and marketing, breathless superlatives from tourists, and the demands of Sydney-siders for it to be simultaneously a piece of gleaming costume jewellery and an unmistakable identity badge for their city.
The Harbour, Scott Bevan. It had taken almost 100 years, but the dreams and visions of colonial Sydney-siders, urban planners, engineers, politicians and workers for a united Sydney Harbour had finally been realised. The building of the bridge played a huge role in the technical revolution of the 1930s and was seen as evidence of Australia's industrial maturity in the mechanical age. It displaced the pastoral and agricultural way of life, ending the horse and buggy and introducing the era of steel bridges, commuter trains and cars. Today, Sydney is home to over 5 million people in a city that is wholly unrecognisable from the densely forested bay Indigenous Australians had called home since long before 1788 and still do today. The Harbour Bridge sits in a redefined Sydney as a symbol of pride and national identity, holding a deep emotional resonance for many Sydney-siders. The bridge, as Ruth Park described,
hangs there like the ghost of the Wheel of Fate, in a sky brindled with sunset, until darkness comes and vanishes away this remarkable shape, which is above all things, that sign of Sydney.
Today's a holiday. Flags are flying everywhere, carnival is in the air, down old Sydney way. Bands are playing, here they come, listen to the big bass drum, listen to that here hooray. When the planes up in the sky fly above the span so high, they're opening the bridge today. What does everybody say? It's the bridge we've been waiting for. Like a giant of steel, at last the dream is real. Doesn't it make you feel you love old Sydney more? Right across the dear old harbour, there's an ever-open door. Australia's sons, let us rejoice. It's the bridge we've been waiting for. Folks from Manly Gay or over over Mosman Way. Now they can take a stroll across to Double Bay. If you miss the midnight ferry, there's a path from shore to shore. Australia's sons, let us rejoice. It's the bridge we've been waiting for. See the people in the street, hear the tramping of the feet. Today's a holiday. Flags are flying everywhere, carnival is in the air, down old Sydney way. Bands are playing, here they come, listen to the big bass drum, listen to that hip hooray. When the planes up in the sky fly above the span so high, they're opening the bridge today. What does everybody say? It's the bridge we've been waiting for. Like a giant of steel, at last the dream is real. Doesn't it make you feel you love old Sydney more? Right across the dear old harbour, there's an ever-open door. Australia's sons, let us rejoice. It's the bridge we've been waiting for. Folks from Manly Gay or over Mosman Way, now they can take a stroll across to Double Bay. If you miss the midnight ferry, there's a path from shore to shore. Australia's sons, let us rejoice. It's the bridge we've been waiting for.